Hello, it's Wednesday the 28th of March. I am Massey, and this is the UK Column News. David Cameron's mission to privatise all that we once owned continues with the hush plan to privatise the MOD. Relinquishing the Ministry of Defence to the private sector should be a wake-up call to any of us who still think that the privatisation of our assets and services is a good thing. There will not be many of us unable to see that the handing over of our national defence to a foreign company is national suicide. No one could argue that in a time of crisis, an American company will favour America, a French company will favour France. That is unless you are Bernard Gray, the Chief of Defence Material at the Defence Equipment and Support branch of the Ministry. Whilst acting as advisor for the Ministry in 2009, Gray compiled a review of acquisition for the Secretary of State, commissioned by none other than the Labour Party, in which he strongly advises the privatisation of the Defence Equipment and Support branch. His recommendation was for the branch to enter into what is termed as a GoCo partnership. GoCo entities are typically government facilities run by the private sector, such as is used in the atomic weapons establishment, which includes the involvement of such infamous companies as Lockheed Martin and Serco, and allows the contractor to access sensitive military information. Gray was Special Advisor to the Secretary of State between 1997 and 1999, during which time he submitted an earlier report, the Strategic Defensive Review, which highlighted the need to modernise the forces. In late 2009, he submitted his report to Parliament to privatise the DE&S branch, at least in part, which led to his appointment to the role of Chief of Defence Material in the Ministry of Defence in December 2010, which sees him in charge of the DE&S. In 2011, the Ministry of Defence announced that Bernard Gray would be handling the finance department of the branch. It will surprise few of you to know that Mr. Gray has a history of working in the banking sector for a number of years, with ties to the Bankers Trust and Chase Manhattan. Is it a coincidence that a man who has experience working for such banks, who has been proposing privatisation of the DE&S for some time now, is suddenly in charge of the division with the newly authorised responsibility of handling accounts? His ambition does not appear to end with the DE&S. Following a new submission, Gray is understood to have identified another 3 options for the privatisation of the Abbey Wood facility in Filton, Bristol, the largest MOD centre in the country, which employs around 10,000 people. This would include establishing an independent body to run the £14 billion procurement programme, which would be run by outside contractors with the ability to make purchasing decisions without ministerial approval and run as a semi-private operation. Which parts of the service will be private will be unclear, but to imagine a defence programme that is privatised, and certainly one dealing in finance, which could then be kept secret from any sort of public scrutiny, should be unthinkable. Companies involved in these talks are the American-based companies Bechtel and Fleur, the Swiss cooperative KPMG, and British companies BAE Systems, who own Filton Airfield and already a prominent supplier to MOD, so no conflict of interest there, Deloitte, and of course Serco. Peter Luff, the Minister of Defence Equipment Support and Technology, told a BBC Radio 4 documentary back in December 2011 in regards to the shake-up, "We will be as radical as we need to be to achieve the changes we need to improve the performance of the organisation, and I think that will involve a greater involvement with the private sector in some way." Privatising the Ministry of Defence is certainly radical. Some might say stupid, others completely crazy. When a private company takes control of the ministry, our defence will be purely a matter of profit, with our forces being used as agents working in the interests of a foreign corporation at worst, or a for-profit organisation at best, none of which will be in the interests of peace or defence. Staying with the theme of privatisation, we here at the UK Column have cast our eye to the DVLA to see what relationship it has with the private sector following the government's decision to privatise our roads. It appears that the DVLA exists as a trading fund, an executive agency of the government that uses its receipts to meet its outgoings. Some trading funds have, as their main function, the collection and supply of information to public and private sectors, and the DVLA certainly performs this function, namely for the purpose of traffic enforcement and collection of taxes. As part of its service, the DVLA passes personal details to private companies. Last year, the DVLA received approximately 9.4 million requests for information, approximately 7.4 million of which were made by police and local councils, which will themselves be privatised in the near future. The remaining 1.6 million requests came from parking firms, insurance, legal and finance leasing companies and members of the public, all of whom the DVLA says demonstrated reasonable cause to receive the information. The DVLA deems reasonable cause as that which concerns incidents and liability. However, Castrol used information from the database to create personalised advertisements to drivers, advising them of which type of engine oil to use based on the make and model of their car. The DVLA said that such use of the database was inappropriate and it was urgently investigating. DVLA charges £2.50 per request. Between 2004 and 2009, the agency received around 18 million requests, raising a total of £44 million, but are adamant that they did not make a profit from these transactions. The DVLA declared profits of £22 million between 2007 and 2008, which was retained by the agency in order to sustain its trading fund's operation. Any surplus is recognised as fees collected in advance of services delivered. What we have here is an organisation making millions of pounds clear profit a year that wants us to believe that at some point in the future they will use that profit for costs that can't possibly amount to the profits they are making. A company that provides absolutely no service other than passing the details of registered keepers to private companies that then use that information to levy distress and make profit from the public. It's a self-sustaining profit monster and little else more. Another common public misunderstanding is that the DVLA collects road tax to be used for the upkeep of our roads. In fact, road tax was abolished in 1937, the process being started by Winston Churchill, in which he said, regarding road tax, "Obviously, this is all nonsense. Such contentions are absurd and constitute an outrage upon the sovereignty of Parliament and upon common sense." The DVLA actually collects vehicle excise duty under the Vehicle Excise and Registration Act 1994, which is a tax on the vehicle, effectively granting the vehicle a licence to operate on the roads based on the amount of CO2 being emitted. The DVLA does not use such revenues for the upkeep of roads. It is in fact local and national taxes which pay for the upkeep of our roads, and now that most of the money is flowing into the private sector in one way or another, this might go some way to explaining the Rothschild-inspired drive for privatisation and why our roads are either filled with roadworks, absent of workers, or littered with cracks and potholes. As the pressure for perpetual war continues, with new war fronts opening up in Africa and Obama expanding his so-called Mission Defense Shield into southern Asia, the US has warned 12 nations to stop buying oil from Iran. The 12 nations in question are Turkey, Taiwan, Sri Lanka, Colombia, Nigeria, Singapore, the Philippines, Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, India and China. This is despite EU nations and Japan being exempt from such threats for a period of 6 months. The US threats have to be viewed as insanity. Sanctions against Iran have done nothing to stop its nuclear program and have instead made sure that the spot price for oil stays far too high for the bankrupt global economy to cope with. As it is, the only thing which seems to be keeping oil prices from going even higher is the plan to release British, American and now French strategic oil reserves. Iran itself is clearly preparing for the impact of continued sanctions. Bloomberg reports a pending deal to buy 3 million metric tons of wheat from India. Financial news now. A new bank fraud seems to be emerging following allegations of mis-selling of interest rate swaps to businesses. So far, 2 banks are implicated, Barclays and Royal Bank of Scotland, and at least one major business, London and West Country Estates, has been forced into administration. Barclays has apologised to what they have described as a small number of business customers, not for mis-selling the product, but for asking them to keep their complaints secret from the Financial Services Authority. RBS, on the other hand, has admitted selling the swaps to thousands of small businesses, including care home operators, greengrocers, family retailers and farmers. The swaps locked their businesses into higher interest rates, and were sold to businesses as protection against rising interest rates at a time when the bank base rate is historically low. Like the PPI mis-selling scandal, the purchasing of these swaps was made a condition of the issuing of a business loan. The FSA has so far failed to get a grip of this problem, and no action has been taken. While this is unlikely to have the wide-reaching impacts on the general public of the PPI mis-selling scandal, it is potentially much more damaging, as companies have been potentially fatally damaged, with implications for people's jobs. With typical arrogance, Mervyn King, Governor of the so-called Bank of England, has stated that the bank's quantitative easing policy is not having the negative effect on the value of pensions that old people say it is. I'm concerned about what has happened to the pension industry and defined benefit pensions, but I think they reflect a wider set of issues. The decline cannot be laid at the door of our programme, he said. The arrogance of Mr. King is staggering, as it emerged today that British pensioners are carrying a staggering £100 billion in personal debt. Of those, over 900,000 pensioners owe in excess of £25,000, including 180,000 people who have personal debts of over £100,000. In fairness, it may well be the case that the decline in pensions cannot be laid at the door of quantitative easing, but it most certainly can be laid at the door of Mervyn King's office in the Bank of England, as he continues to fail to promote any policies which offer any realistic solution to the continuing financial crisis. The bank is keeping the door firmly open to continued quantitative easing. Meanwhile, in the US, Ben Bernanke had stock prices rising again on Monday with his announcement that the Fed is ready to start a new round of quantitative easing soon, in combination with the continued provision of 0% interest rate money to the banks. The latest stock market euphoria did not last long, however, on the news that Britain's economy contracted by more than expected in the last quarter of 2011, and the realistic view the markets took of European leaders' claims that the euro crisis is almost over. It is unclear which brand of Afghani-derived heroin European leaders were on when they made that statement, as Spain falls back into recession, and with Portugal in a worse state than Greece, which itself is unlikely to end up with a government after the forthcoming elections, and Ireland's referendum on the suicidal Eurozone austerity pact due on the 31st of May. Just yesterday, the Organisation for the Economic Cooperation and Development said that the Eurozone should ramp the so-called Euro Rescue funds up to at least €1 trillion. Poor Nate Rothschild, following the loss of his libel case against the Daily Mail over the Mail's correct reporting of the love-in between him, Peter Mandelson and Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, he finds himself kicked off the board of his mining company Boomi. Shareholders in Boomi had called for an extraordinary general meeting to kick Nate off the board, but in the end elected to do it a little more privately. Coutts & Co., the private bank used by the Queen, has been hit with an £8.5 million fine, the largest ever imposed for money laundering. The bank was found to have failed to conduct proper checks into nearly 3/4 of its high net worth clients who hold what are described as sensitive positions. The clients concerned include people reputed to be criminals and drug dealers, or foreign politicians and government officials considered to be corrupt. Coutts is the private banking division of Royal Bank of Scotland, itself implicated in the interest rate swap mis-selling we have already mentioned, and member of the Rothschild Inter-Alpha Group banking cartel. Coutts' failure to meet its regulatory obligations is not new. In 2010, it and RBS were fined £5.6 million for failing to prevent its accounts being used to finance terrorist organisations. Perhaps it is time for Her Majesty to disassociate herself from such an institution. Health Now. They are growing in popularity and, as the government's austerity measures increase, their use is set to follow. I am of course talking about antidepressants. The latest figures show that in 2007, in the UK alone, there were 34 million prescriptions for antidepressants, of which more than half were a type of drug known as SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, such as Prozac and Cerazette. More than 40 million people worldwide are estimated to have taken Prozac at some point in their lives since it was approved by the Federal Drug Administration in 1998. While their widespread use might suggest they are safe, more and more people are becoming concerned, both privately and professionally, that these drugs may not be as safe as was first thought, and may in fact be a threat, not only to people's health, but also to the community in general. Surprisingly, there have been no long-term studies regarding their safety, yet Harvard Medical School terms them as being remarkably safe and effective. and that they can be used for a range of conditions such as anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, eating disorders, and even premenstrual syndrome. This recommendation is given in spite of the many side effects listed on their own site, which include, but are not limited to, insomnia, headaches, and even risk of suicide. But what they fail to include are that the drugs are highly addictive and can also cause confusion, muscle rigidity, internal organ complications, psychotic behaviour, and most remarkably, anxiety and depression. What should be apparent is that these risks highlight the real dangers in taking antidepressants, or happy pills as they are ironically dubbed, most worryingly the risk of death. Between 1993 and 2002, there were 4,767 deaths in England and Wales involving antidepressants, according to the Office of National Statistics. 20% of all deaths from overdose or poisoning were antidepressant related, which increased by 18% between 1993 and 1997. Antidepressant use has grown considerably since then, so we can expect that this figure will have risen in line with their popularity. Death rates from antidepressants were 2.5 times higher in the most deprived districts. In February 2008, the independent medical journal, Public Library of Science, which independently accepts no advertising money from Big Pharma, reported that in as many as half of all cases, antidepressant drugs are no more effective than a sugar pill or placebo. Dr. Eric Turner on National News in America back in January 2008 claimed that he believed that pharmaceutical companies were suppressing negative trials. The I Am Fishhead documentary, currently showing over the web, makes a suggestion that antidepressants are linked to the increased psychotic and sociopathic behaviour in our culture, which is prominently featured in high-end corporate rooms where decisions to poison or kill for profit are most commonly reached. One thing seems apparent from these reports, and that is that antidepressants are not as harmless as GPs are making out, and their use should be regarded with caution. A number of mainstream newspapers have reported recently that taking low doses of aspirin every day can prevent and possibly even treat cancer. Not only is it put to the public that aspirin can prevent and even treat cancer, but also that the patient would need to take the drug for about 3 to 5 years to get any protection, and if they stayed on the drug for longer, their cancer death risk went down even further. Aspirin has also been marketed as aiding people in preventing heart attacks. It almost sounds like the mainstream media are advocating that we take aspirin daily for the rest of our lives, since cancer is more prevalent in the middle age and older. Unfortunately, there is a side effect that taking the drug increases the risk of major heart bleed, but we are reassured that this risk of bleeding only exists during the first few years of aspirin therapy. Oh well, that's okay then. Well, perhaps not. Studies appear to show that strokes due to hemorrhaging went up significantly due to aspirin's ability to thin the blood, as it converts into acetic acid and eats up red blood cells necessary for transporting oxygen around the body. A randomised clinical trial testing aspirin in 5,011 elderly people showed that hemorrhagic strokes were increased fourfold with the use of aspirin. Further complications such as gastrointestinal disorders, allergies, stomach ulcers, kidney dysfunction, and even death could also be caused by long-term aspirin use. According to Associated Press, as far back as 1999, death by over-the-counter painkillers such as aspirin was the 15th most common cause of death in America. That figure has long since increased, with deaths as a result of painkillers surpassing those caused by heroin and cocaine, even in some areas outnumbering those that were killed from motor vehicle crashes. Long-term aspirin use is also linked to corroding the nervous system, leading to pathologies such as Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's. Further to this, in 2003, results from a nurses' health study involving 88,000 women suggested that taking at least 2 regular tablets per week raises the risk of pancreatic cancer, not reduces it. However, perhaps one of the main reasons aspirin is being pushed as a medication to prevent and cure cancer is that it actually induces nutritional deficiencies, which enable greedy pharmaceutical companies to increase their potential market as more and more of us become sick without ever realising why. Aspirin depletes the body of folic acid, as well as iron, potassium, sodium and vitamin C. Symptoms of folic acid depletion include anemia, birth defects, headaches, fatigue, hair loss, insomnia, diarrhea, and of course increased infection. In light of such conflicting information, those that are taking the drug regularly would be well advised to research the drug and its possible side effects themselves, so that they may determine what is safe for them to take and not rely on third-party advice which may have a vested interest. And finally, the BBC reported yesterday that an Essex woman, told for years that she did not legally exist, has finally received proof of her birth. A bureaucratic mix-up meant that Jade Jacobs Brooks, who is 20 years old, did not receive a birth certificate after she was born during a family holiday in Spain. Over the years, she has been refused jobs and been unable to get a passport because she could not provide employers with proof of identity, as she effectively did not exist within the system. This we consider strange, since none of us can use our birth certificates as identity, since that would constitute fraud, as the name is copyrighted by the Crown and clearly says so on the long form of the birth certificate. Strange that the government had made it so difficult for Jade to enter the system, when so many of us are desperately trying to leave it. Still, these are strange times. I'm Malcolm Massey, and this has been the UK Column News. Thank you for watching.